Hello, and welcome to this 55th episode in my series, Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. Have you noticed, like me, that there appears to be a lot of hatred in our world? Our culture wars are fueled by and are a manifestation of this hatred. I'm not going to comment further on it in this video, but the assassination attempt on Donald Trump recently is the most dramatic expression of this hatred I've seen for a while. While we don't fully know the real motivation of the shooter, Thomas Crooks, we have seen many reactions of disappointment that he was unsuccessful. How do you explain where this is coming from? More generally, where does hatred come from? What unites some groups in their hatred of other groups? Are there any people or groups that you hate? If so, why do you hate them? You might hesitate to call it hatred, but do you find some people extremely contemptible and unlikable? Do you wish we could get beyond hatred? I believe we need to understand this before we can get beyond it. In this video, I want to provide a basic way to think about and answer these questions. If you haven't been here before, my name is Michael Dewan Herrick, and I'm a psychotherapist in private practice in London. I'm concerned with how critical social justice, also known as woke, has impacted psychotherapy and every other realm of life these days. But let's jump right into the issue of hatred. I can't explain all reasons for hatred, but I can provide a way to think about much of it. This will require first identifying a basic developmental sequence that all human beings pass through. Some get further than others, but what I will describe are the major stages of this developmental process. Understanding this first will allow us to reflect on the origins and causes of hatred. This developmental sequence comes out of the work of the integral thinker Ken Wilber, but Wilber didn't just make this up. It's based on his comprehensive study of dozens of developmental models. Wilber simply condensed them into a simplified model with just 4 stages. I know some of you are ready to click out now. It might sound like an intellectual brain ache you don't have time for. I promise I'll keep this part as short as possible and to the point. It will be easy to understand even if you don't agree with it, and provide what I have suggested, a way to understand hatred. Here are the names of the 4 stages of this model: egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, and integrative. We all start our lives at the egocentric stage. As infants, we gradually emerge from a less differentiated state of fusion with the world and increasingly experience ourselves as separate from it. In this stage, we identify with our own needs and desires. We pursue our own gratification and see others as either facilitators or obstacles to those needs and desires. Yes, this is narcissistic. It's a normal part of our early development. If it persists into adulthood without constraints, it becomes abnormal and problematic. At some point, hopefully, we become socialized. We begin to recognize and value relationships for their own sake and not simply as a means to the end of our own desires. We take a role that comes with expectations for how we should treat others. We delay gratification in service to our relationships and to whatever group we identify with. This could be our family, our friends, our tribe, our ethnic group, or our nation. We go beyond the selfishness of egocentrism, and our identity is constellated around our relations with others, with our group. Those outside of our group are not included in our circle of consideration and care. We are ethnocentric. Like the egocentric stage, this is also a normal stage of development. While most will acknowledge that the ethnocentric stage is a moral improvement over the egocentric and narcissistic stage, for many it stops short of a moral perspective with a more inclusive embrace. At the world-centric stage, that circle of care expands to include all people everywhere. There is identification with humanity, not just our own group. This might even include all living beings. Our egocentric desires, as well as the needs and desires of our group or tribe, are subordinated to this greater circumference of care. I'll get to the 4th stage, integrative, in a minute, but let's pause here and clarify something important. A common objection to developmental models is that they are hierarchical and assert that later stages are better than earlier stages. I want to address this by offering the integral principle that development is a process of transcending and including. That means that each stage is not separate from the previous stages, but includes them. It doesn't make sense to say that one stage is better than another, as if they can be compared as distinctly different things. At the same time, later stages are more inclusive, and in that sense, they could be seen as better. Here's an analogy to clarify what I mean. On a physical level, we can recognize the importance of our skeletons. They provide a basic structure for our bodies. Muscles aren't better than bones, but they allow bones to be put to use. Beyond our muscles, the nervous system isn't better, but it allows us to have control over our skeleton and muscular systems. Ideally, these systems work together. They are all transcended and included within our whole body. Egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric stages of development are similar. The egocentric stage allows us to know and pursue our own needs and desires. It gives us a fundamental sense of agency. Ideally, the ethnocentric stage allows for individuals to pursue their own desires, but within the constraints of a social milieu and its necessary conventions. It provides a greater context and set of parameters for those egocentric drives. And ideally, the world-centric stage allows for, while also constrains both the egocentric and the ethnocentric stages. It doesn't obliterate and jettison them, but it gives them a greater context for their morally acceptable expression. If you're liking this video so far, please give it a like, subscribe, click to the bell for notifications, and share it with a friend. I'm determined to make this channel grow, and your support's greatly appreciated. So, back to our topic. There's a word for this ideal relationship between these first three stages. It's called integrative or integral. This is the fourth stage of development. When this ideal is not met, there can be antagonism and hatred between the stages. Each stage sees the other stages as its enemies. So let's go stage by stage and see how hatred can arise. Starting with the egocentric stage, individuals or groups operating from this stage will tend to hate whatever stands in the way of them getting what they want, whether that be an individual or a group. Their argument will often not be framed in terms of hatred, but in terms of freedom. They might claim to be libertarian. They chafe at regulations on business. They extol the greatness of the free market. They demand that they be affirmed in whatever identity they prefer, regardless of the consequences to others, based on their right to freedom of choice. They might quote Ayn Rand or Nietzsche. Any objections that stand in the way of what they want will be framed in terms of hatred. If you stand in their way, you are engaging in hate speech. Any constraints on their desires will be construed as some form of oppression, motivated by hatred. At the ethnocentric stage, hatred can arise toward anyone who does not conform to the group's norms and beliefs. This can apply to those within their group who blaspheme or act in heretical ways. Hatred can also arise toward individuals and groups that are outside of its membership. This is where racism and xenophobia come from. Here again, the argument is not typically framed in terms of hatred. It's more about loyalty to one's group or a set of common moral imperatives. At the ethnocentric stage, the egocentric stage is seen as selfish and evil and outside groups as a threat. At the world-centric stage, as virtuous as it may sound on the surface, there is plenty of opportunities for hatred of both the egocentric and ethnocentric stages. Rich people are generally abhorred for their excess wealth and the selfishness that drives it. Anyone deemed to be privileged is hated, although this could be denied. Ethnocentric people are hated for their preoccupation with their own group, for their moral judgmentalism, for wanting to enforce borders and limit immigration, for taking pride in their history or their group's accomplishments. World-centric tends to be globalist and may get behind the idea of a new world order where there is no private property. Everyone eats bugs and all are happy. Anyone not on board with their agenda is worthy of condemnation. Or this might just be a conspiracy theory that fuels hatred on the part of the egocentric and the ethnocentric toward the world-centric, who would compromise their freedom and the sovereignty of a nation. Ideally, the process of development is such that each stage is incorporated within and constrained by the subsequent stages. Here, the ethnocentric stage makes a place for egocentrism, and the world-centric makes a place for both. But it also sets parameters on their expression, so it can feel to those stuck in earlier stages that these constraints are some sort of violation. Having to contend with constraints can be irritating and provoke hatred. There's the feeling of, don't tell me what I can and can't do, and don't tell me not to be loyal to my group or proclaim its values. Earlier stages, at least at first, tend to resent later stages. Also, the need to not only transcend but also include earlier stages irritates later stages. Having to find ways to honor and include previous stages can seem like going backwards into amoral territory. Each stage emerges with a sense of having made a monumental discovery. There's something transformative in its self-evident superiority over the previous stage. Those promoting values from earlier stages can be seen as morally compromised, if not evil. They haven't gotten with the program. Simultaneous with this glorious realization and achievement, each successive stage also entails a sacrifice and a burden. From egocentric to ethnocentric is the sacrifice of selfish pursuits and taking on responsibility for the well-being of others in your group. From ethnocentric to world-centric is a sacrifice of exclusive concern for one's own group and responsibility for the well-being of humanity. Hatred can come up through resentment about these sacrifices and the burdens imposed. It is one thing to enjoy the virtue signaling that comes with this greater world-centric vision. It's another to live it. At the integrative stage, all previous stages are valued but included. But there is also an understanding that earlier stages must be constrained by later stages. This is challenging enough at the level of individual development. How many people do you know that have made friends with their own primal desires, constrained them in service to their relationships, affirmed an identity and a set of responsibilities within their own group, and contextualized and constrained this in relation to the whole of humanity? Have you? It's even more challenging at the collective or political level, and there's some reasons for this. Most noteworthy, perhaps, is the politician who masks a fundamentally egocentric orientation by appealing to voters at the ethnocentric or possibly world-centric stages. This is a common characterization of Trump. He's described as a narcissist interested only in his own power, who has galvanized support from the basket of religious, patriotic, ethnocentric deplorables. He also appeals to his fellow Republicans, egocentric narcissists, who are interested in increasing their already considerable wealth. This may be true, I don't know, but hatred of Trump is also potentially hatred of the first two stages of development. Even if Trump isn't a narcissist, it is convenient to characterize him that way if you want to reject the values he falsely declares. I think it's important to recognize that arguing for constraints is not the same as hatred. This is important. Not all who hate Trump completely reject the first two stages. They may just hate Trump in fear that he will foster an ethnocentric wave without constraints. For those who will vote for him, it may be that they recognize his narcissism and they don't like it. But as their normal and, I dare say, healthy ethnocentric orientation has been neglected and demonized, they see him as someone who will validate and restore that to our collective values. He will make it okay to put America first and take pride in being an American. Like other politicians, Trump accrues support not only by declaring the values of his chosen constituency, whether he believes them or not, but also by generating hatred toward his opponents. In this case, toward those who ostensibly hold a world-centric vision. Sometimes this entails distorting the truth, exaggerations, and conspiracy theories. The left, or what may appear to be world-centric, is no better. Here there are politicians and political activists who are also primarily oriented to egocentric stage. They're interested in their own power. They make appeals to those who espouse world-centric values and inflame their hatred of the egocentric and the ethnocentric. They do this while mostly interested in their own advancement. They don't seek to include the values of the first two stages and propose reasonable constraints. They condone rioting and label anyone concerned with immigration to be a racist. They bail rioters out of jail. They agree with ideas like defunding the police. They legitimate the egocentric and ethnocentric population that is also, like them, masquerading as world-centric. While I've been aiming to keep this as simple as possible, and I'm not sure I've succeeded, I can't fail to mention another complicating factor. Not all people or politicians or activists who advocate a particular set of values, whether egocentric, ethnocentric, or world-centric, are unmindful of other competing values. Anyone at the integrative stage will find themselves advocating for the values of all three previous stages at one point or another. Unfortunately, it seems that this is practically political suicide. Voting blocs have their concerns. Opponents are ready to pounce on inconsistencies. The whole system is set up for zero-sum antagonistic competition. Too many of us approach it all like a football game, and we hope our team wins. We hope the other team is crushed out of existence. It's a mistake to prematurely characterize anyone as simply at a particular stage of development because they've espoused some values and launch an attack accordingly. Maybe, for instance, Nigel Farage is an ethnocentric bigot, or maybe he's promoting a more ethnocentric agenda because it has been neglected and he also does have some world-centric understanding. Maybe. And maybe some DEI consultants recognize our common humanity in addition or even prior to our racial identities. Maybe. In any case, I think we should not draw conclusions hastily, as this is more likely to represent and provoke our hatred. Ultimately, I believe we need to be able to call out and constrain the excesses of egocentrism and ethnocentrism and establish reasonable constraints on what they are allowed to do. We also need to call out the world-centric orientation for its demonization of the egocentric and the ethnocentric stages and its failure to integrate them. We need to confront hatred and get beyond it. This doesn't mean labeling anyone who disagrees with us as a hate-filled bigot. It doesn't mean lifting all constraints that are uncomfortable or inconvenient for people. It means integrating all three stages and accepting that each one requires trade-offs. It means not being manipulated by politicians and political activists and consigning ourselves to a political tribe full of ethnocentric hatred toward other political tribes. I've only just barely scratched the surface of this. I hope that I've at least sketched out a basic framework for you to think about the issue of hatred. Frankly, I'm sick of it. Quite literally, it makes me feel ill. I see it everywhere I turn. I suspect that you do too. Maybe you were caught in your own hatreds. I'm not immune to it myself. Please consider what I've shared. Getting beyond hatred doesn't mean not being angry about things. It does mean listening to and trying to understand where other people are coming from. It means not automatically judging earlier stages of development, but appreciating their place in all of our lives. It means being savvier about not being manipulated by those who would inflame our hatred for their own profit. It means doing the work of developing through each stage and integrating each in our own lives. Thanks for staying to the end. Take care of yourself and each other, and let your judgments of others come from love and not hatred. That's it for now. Goodbye.